Hello everyone and welcome to this month's TELedvisors webinar. This month we're going to be talking about gamification. So this is Sarah Thorneycroft from the University of New England. Sarah's educational background is wide-ranging, including academic development, learning design, teacher professional development and primary and secondary teaching. She works extensively in the development of online teaching and learning and researches in the fields of digital scholarship, practice-led education in learning and teaching, games-based learning and professional development. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi all. Look, I just want to start with my little semantic rant because Colin did name this session gamification. I don't use the word gamification. It's a term I have a problem with because it's something that we have a lot of baggage around, particularly from the marketing industry, but I see it a lot more in education than I'd like. Is gamification implemented in the form where they just scrape an engagement layer off games, so they badges or a point system, and chuck it on top of existing unchanged learning. And I think that results in some really problematic experiences. I like to use the analogy that, if you're looking at a chocolate cake and going, you know what, people love chocolate cake. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to scrape the chocolate icing off the top and put it on this steak. And all you end up with is something that tastes pretty terrible and nobody wants to eat the steak. So anyway, that's my semantic rant. What do I use better? What terms do I like better? Games-based learning is better, but it's still something that can be awkward depending on people's concept of it. Nowadays, I like to use terms like games-informed learning or games-informed learning design, or even just borrowing game concepts and just stating that as what we're doing. Because I don't design games. I just analyze games and borrow some concepts that I think might achieve certain goals for me and apply them in learning design. So that's where I'm coming from. But today I thought I'd actually just walk you through a few different games. I'm sure we all have various experiences of games and being a gamer, whether we define ourselves as being a gamer or not. But I personally think that game designers are doing e-learning a lot better than we are, because learnification, no, kill it with fire. Because game designers aren't designing e-learning. I've read somewhere once that the people who are making the best vegetarian cuisine aren't vegetarians because they're not designing with the ideology. And I think there's some of that that can apply here. As games are really excellent and far more successful than we are at pure bums on seats, pure engagement, and mass engagement in learning and developing skills. But in games, the learning and skill development is almost never explicit. And so people have a lot of trouble with this idea of learning being divorced from content. But I don't think games and learning are at all mutually exclusive, even non-serious games. So let's have a look at some things. Mobile games are just nice, easy things to show you. And the first one I'm going to show you is actually a kid's game, but I had a lot of fun playing this just on my own well after Hannah had gone to bed. So it's TELEd, which is very loosely based on the periodic table, but it's not actually designed to teach science. An actual chemist would weep at the content. It's nothing to do with that. It's just using chemistry and a lab as a narrative. And so when you open up the game, this is what you get. You get a blue blob bouncing up and down and some lab apparatus. What you won't get is any words. And this is one really interesting thing that games do. And because you don't get any words, all that you can do is just poke things and hope something happens that gives you a clue as to what you're supposed to do. Kids are really good at this. They just touch shit and they don't care if it breaks. Adults are very bad at this because they're very worried about breaking things. And so you can just move around the screen and poke things and hope some things happen. And a thing happened and you've got instant feedback. Mark mentioned the immediacy of feedback loop in games, and that's one thing that I really like about them as well. But so all of this, all of the gameplay is driven without any words. And whenever I ask people if they think they could introduce their discipline or introduce a topic without using any words, their brains explode. Because we are, particularly in higher education, we are so enamored with the written word, and we have such a hard time getting away from the idea that we have to use the written word to deliver instructions, to deliver content, to go into an environment where not a single word is used, and yet people are able to learn and explore and develop skills, is a difficult thing for people to conceptualize sometimes. So, another game which is not a kids game, but it's very cleverly designed, and kids find, well, my kid, who's 4, finds it really enjoyable, and she doesn't have any difficulty working out how to use it, but adults can equally get enjoyment out of it. So when you open it up, this is all you get. And again, you do get some words in this one, and you even get an offer for hints if you're stuck. But again, you just have to jump in and kind of see what happens. And then things happen and you get feedback and you learn from that. And so you're 4:33. Sorry, I shouldn't look at the chats as I'm going on because that's really disjointed to listen to. It's all good. And so this is a neat little game that you can either play really simply just by randomly mixing things and seeing what happens along the way, or you can get into a really high-level analysis of how you might actually make things and what types of things you can make. And if you're interested, yes, there's a Jedi. And so you can play it at all sorts of different levels, and that's a very clever approach to streaming that learning design really struggles with that level of differentiation. And I don't think we would be able to differentiate against such a wide age and skill group in the way that this type of game does. Next you have, I won't open this up because it takes forever to load and I'm in airplane mode. The much more sophisticated games like Pokemon Go, World of Warcraft, Minecraft that have a really heavy reliance on very sexy graphics, a really heavy use of lore. If you're not familiar with lore, that's the narrative world that exists in games. And very complex achievements and mechanics and things like that. And so you have a whole spectrum of things. And when people hear games or talk about video games, their mind immediately goes to the very sophisticated extensive development games like that, rather than some of the more simple games, which are the ones that I like to look at to borrow concepts from a lot of the time, particularly because, as I mentioned in the chat, I've never had a budget to work with, actually. I might spend $20 on hosting here or $50 on a plugin here, but I've actually never really had a budget to work with for development. And so everything I do has been very low level and non-sexy looking. But I've looked at games and borrowed the concepts, yes, L-O-R-E, lore, to do the design work that I've done. I'm just going to swap from my iPad now into the browser. To talk about Twine. So when we're talking about games getting simple, this is one of the simplest forms a game can take. Twine is kind of an indie game design engine that produces, at its lowest level, these very old school choose your own adventure text-based games. And so this is Cat Simulator. And you can't click in the screen sharing Twitch, you have to actually be in the window. And so you just get to navigate your way through the game and using the adaptive path structure of the game, but it's very lightweight, it's only text. And the actual development backend is very simple to use and anyone can use it, it's free to use. And so it's one way that we can borrow the adaptive pathway element that many games have into our own design without any funding or development or access to game designers or anything like that. And I also want to talk about things that aren't computer games like golf, because I think a lot of the time the IRL stuff gets left out of games discussion entirely, but the principles are the same. And so we can look at real life games like golf, and we can still borrow concepts from there to apply into our own learning design. So golf, for instance, has a really simple restrictive structure, a very simple set of rules, and you basically repeat the same thing over and over again. You hit the little ball into the cup and you keep doing that. Courses might look slightly different, but you basically just hit the ball into the cup over and over again. But the primary focus of a game like golf is skill development. And so there's a really sophisticated range of skills that you can develop to hit the ball into the cup much more effectively, which is why there's pro golfers. So now that we've had a whistle-stop tour of a few games, what can we take from this? I thought, since the talk's called Perils and Pitfalls, or no, what's it called? Pitfalls and Pluses. I'd talk about some of the things we shouldn't do, and then some of the things that we can do, and some of the concepts we can borrow from these games. Things that we shouldn't do is generally make games, unless we have a huge budget. Maybe you have a grant, maybe you are at a university with more money than we have, or maybe you have a particular project budget, and you can access game developers and you can access graphic designers and people with skills for making things look very sexy, and you've got lots of learning designers to work with. That's great. But most people realistically can't engage in that level of development. And when that's your situation, the kind of things you might end up with might suck. I've had that experience. I've created a lot of things that sucked because I just didn't have access to really sophisticated resources. And when we approach things with that learning mentality rather than an engagement and entertainment mentality, that's where things can start going awry and they can become very twee and painful very quickly. And so generally, I think we shouldn't try to design games. I think it's much better to just look at games and try and borrow some of the concepts that they use and apply them into our learning design. I've mentioned again, another thing we shouldn't do is just shoehorn superficial badges or points onto existing content as an attempt to try and motivate people. Because I think that rarely works effectively. Another thing that I don't enjoy seeing game mechanics being used for extortion. Anyone who's familiar with the Moodle Dailies project I did years ago, after I presented on that one time, some people went away and used the conditional activities in Moodle to start holding resources ransom and that, you know, you can't access this until you've gotten this mark in a quiz. And I'm going, no, that's not the point. Don't do that. And so it's not to be something we should be using as punishment to extort people to do things in a certain way. So then what should we do? What bits of games can we start incorporating into our own learning design? One that I've experimented with a bit is a reduced reliance on words and explicit instruction. Because one thing that's often lacking in students as a skill, regardless of the age or existing background of students, is the ability to be really self-motivated in a learning environment and to explore and take risks. And so if we can use a reduced reliance on words to encourage students to explore and find things of their own accord, then that's some skill development that might be useful for us, even if we're not actually doing games. And so one example of this is a unit on crime fiction that I worked with. And obviously with crime fiction, you have the content of the literature that you're engaging with focusing on crime and forensics, which involves a lot of exploration and analysis and things like that. And so we began the unit with a crime scene. And this is a really old school, what do you call it when you've got an image with links in it? You've got an image with links in it. And so you can just mouse around this image and find links that take you off to various activities in the site. And we did give students a get out of jail free card, but mostly we wanted to encourage students to be presented with a thing, and rather than wait for instructions or wait to be told what to do, to begin exploring. Before I show you the next thing, I might just pop back to the webinar and just check the chat in case there's like 9 billion things I'm not addressing. No, there's 47 billion things I'm not addressing. Does anyone want to do any questions now? Or shall I keep talking for another couple of minutes? Okay. So another, I mentioned the Moodle dailies. And this is, I mean, I kind of cringe looking at this now because this was quite a few years ago now, and fairly unsophisticated both in terms of my thinking and the actual implementation. But one of the concepts, as well as the reduced reliance on word and use of visual cues and things, one of the things I wanted to investigate was the use of narrative and how we can borrow the rich use of narrative and lore from games and use that in a learning context. And so the Moodle Dailies uses this extremely painful kind of Grand Theft Auto type narrative to drive people around. Less painfully, another project, which is not a project of mine, I briefly talked to them about it, but this was a project of Naomi McGrath, who's another learning designer here, who worked with an accounting academic. And I won't play you all of this video, it's just a very short little video to show you that they used a very strong narrative throughout the unit to engage students in accounting practice and enable skills to be applied without doing an actual placement to try and apply skills to real life accounting situations. Okay, so you get the idea on that one, I hope. And so this narrative, they actually had a bit of a budget, and were able to make a series of videos that sustained this narrative throughout the unit, and that was quite effective at engaging students in accounting practice as it applies in reality, which can be quite intangible and frankly not always very interesting. That's about all I have time to show you. And I think that's my 20 minutes about up. So, Colin, what's now? Are we having question time?
Sure, let's do that. Well, I'm going to indulge myself because you get to do that when you're emceeing. So,
I'll stop my sharing. There we go.
well, I guess a quick question, actually a question for both of you. So what are the things that what are the most valuable and the easiest sort of quick wins that we can take from game concepts that you've come across? I mean, for me, I think feedback is pretty high on the list. What else is there? Or you can talk about feedback.
I feel like I've kind of mentioned it already with the ideas of encouraging students to be self-motivated and explore rather than wait for instruction. Engaging students in narrative, and particularly if you're using like really low barrier tools like Twine, or even just using Moodle conditional activities, then you can engage students in narrative as a quick win. You don't need a lot of budget, you don't need a lot of time to do that kind of thing.
Do you have any thoughts, Mark? You might have caught him by surprise.
Now, there has been some work questioning the whole role of narrative in games, and it's quite a contentious area actually, with some academics actually saying games don't contain any narrative at all. But I mean I think they're talking mainly largely first-person shooter games. But when you see things like Grand Theft Auto, it's very hard to argue that there's not a narrative in that. And choose your own adventure games, they're very, that whole genre is based on narrative. And I think that, narrative is, to my perspective, is really critical for, once again, engaging users, engaging players in making that journey, and how you actually connect this story with their actual learning is a really critical aspect of game design.
It's also, if I can just jump in, one other quick win that I didn't mention, that I did mean to mention, which is that if it works for your discipline or the topic that you're working in, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, and there's no reason you can't just utilise existing games, particularly existing non-serious games. And so something that's in the front of my mind at the moment is Pokemon Go and the new raids for legendaries, which require you to interact with people and to actually get a group of people to a certain location at a certain time to engage in a certain way requires quite sophisticated management skills, which there's no reason a management subject couldn't utilise that and just use an existing game without any need for developing anything. You can just borrow something that already exists. And there's plenty of games that you could use in all sorts of disciplines, depending on what you wanted to achieve. So if something out there already exists, there's no reason that you need to develop anything.
Okay, so I'm just sort of scrolling through the chat here. Does anyone else out there have questions they want to speak up and ask?
Oh, sorry about the sound on the video. I knew you wouldn't be able to hear it, but because there were captions, it didn't really matter, and it was just kind of a generic free audio jingle thing, so you didn't miss much.
I think it looked great.
I suppose I could have a go at asking a question for both Sarah and Mark. One of the things that I've been thinking about, because we work in the academic development space as well, if there were quick wins and opportunities that the gamified learning can bring, and academics were not aware of those, how do we approach them and convince them that this is something that's worth doing? Because some people tend to have this idea that the gamification is something that's quite big and it's going to take a lot of time and effort. Have you had that experience with certain academics? And do you have any idea?
Look, personally, I just don't have the energy to spend a lot of time selling the unsellable. And so my approach tends to be to either just do things myself or to work with people who really are interested. And then you can use the development work that comes out of that as a selling point for other people, because a lot of people don't want to talk about anything unless they can see an example that's already worked in their context, in their discipline, because obviously every discipline is extremely different and no comparisons whatsoever can be drawn. But yeah, I do tend to not spend a lot of time trying to convince people, and I spend my time just doing things, and hopefully the product of those doing things can get other people who might be reluctant to engage.
Yeah, hi, Chi. Look, I think that there's real opportunities there to look at innovations in learning and teaching, and there are lots of funding opportunities actually out there too, both philanthropic funds and also university-based funding to look at those sorts of innovations. And games-based learning is still perceived as innovative practice. So as long as you actually carefully look at the curriculum and see that it is appropriate to build a game out of, because not all areas are, and there's interest from the academic. I think that there's interesting partnerships that can develop, research partnerships can develop between academic developers and academics in conceptualising those games, finding funding to build them, and generate research output and publications from that. And look, I mean, I think that that's where the whole divide between, I suppose, and it is a perceived divide between professional staff and academics, and that where are the incentives for professional staff to actually look at publication outcomes. But I think that that's becoming an increasingly blurred boundary. I think that for any of us in academic development area or in academia, research outcomes is still something that's worthwhile looking at, so that we can attend conferences, share our expertise, and make a contribution to new teaching and learning approaches.
Yeah, no, that sounds pretty good. I see a question in the chat from Tim saying, so do games actually enable or encourage empathy, and how hard is it to achieve this? I guess my take is absolutely. I've played a few games recently where I've felt an incredible connection with the characters. There was a sort of an indie game that came out probably about 5 years ago called Papa Yo, and it's basically sort of a metaphoric story of a kid dealing with his father's alcoholism. But like I cared more about the characters in that one game than I think I have in sort of books or stories or anything that I've read in the equivalent time. How have other people been touched by? Are there particular games that have sort of had an impact on people? Anyone? All right, just me. Okay. There's still a few little posts and comments coming up here. Do we have any other questions? Definitely a lot of resources. Sorry, go on.
I feel bad because there's obviously a bucket load of things that went on in the chat that I didn't see while I was talking. I'm trying to scroll back now, but it's kind of one of those Seinfeld situations where you sort of missed the moment.
It's been a very active discussion, so I think that's been good in itself.
So
and
hopefully nobody's weeping that their question hasn't been answered.
Oh, you got to speak up at some point, I think. And yes, and very good point there from Chia. You can always continue this discussion through the discussion forum on the Moodle side. All right. Well, I might stop the recording. You don't have to, you don't have to go. But I'll just, once again, thanks both Mark and Sarah. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in this space. I definitely think that there's a lot that we can learn from game developers and people sort of, slightly to the side of education. So, yeah, if everyone would just like to show their appreciation in the chat, or and thank you very much.